The Adventure of the Sussex Vampire. Sherlock Holmes sat hunched in his armchair, a letter held between his long, thin fingers. He was studying it against the gray, diffuse light that filtered through the tall window of our Baker Street lodgings. A wry smile played upon his lips, a sign I had come to recognize as the harbinger of something truly out of the ordinary. Outside, the London fog swirled like a phantom, but within our rooms, the only auras present were the sharp scent of his shag tobacco and the palpable silence of intense concentration. I set aside my newspaper. My curiosity piqued. Something of interest? Holmes? I ventured. Or is it merely another missive from a society admirer? He chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. Neither, my dear Watson. This is something far more piquant. It is a communication from a firm of solicitors I have had dealings with before. Morrison, and Dodd. They are forwarding a query from a most distressed client. The problem itself is, on the surface, utterly grotesque. So much so that one is tempted to dismiss it as the ravings of a madman. He tapped the letter with a forefinger. And yet, the client, a Mr. Robert Ferguson, is known to be a man of impeccable standing and robust character, a man not given to flights of fancy. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with intellectual fervor. The subject, Watson, he said, lowering his voice conspiratorially, is vampires. The client is convinced he is married to one. I confess I stared at him, utterly dumbfounded. Vampires? Holmes, this is the end of the 19th century, not the Dark Ages. Surely this is a jest, or the man is unwell. Precisely the reaction one would expect, he replied calmly, folding the letter and placing it into his well-worn pocketbook. And that is why the case promises to be so fascinating. When the impossible presents itself, and all other explanations have been exhausted, a true reasoner must begin to consider it. This Mr. Ferguson is a man of considerable fortune, a celebrated athlete in his youth, and a hero of the Matabele campaign. Now, he writes with a hand that trembles so violently the script is barely legible. He speaks of a horror that has invaded his home, a horror centered around his own wife and their infant child. He begs for my assistance, but also for my discretion, as the scandal would be ruinous. He rose from his chair and began to pace the length of our cluttered sitting room, a lion in its cage. The details are as follows. Robert Ferguson, a man of around 50, married 5 years ago. His wife, a Peruvian lady of breathtaking beauty, is considerably younger. By all accounts, it was a love match, and their life together at his ancestral home, Cheeseman's, in Sussex, was idyllic. They have an infant son, a babe of only a few months. Ferguson also has a son from his first marriage, a boy of 15 named Jack, who unfortunately suffered an accident in his youth and has limited use of his legs, though his spirit is apparently as bright as ever. Holmes paused by the window, staring out into the swirling gray mist, as if the Sussex Downs were visible through it. The trouble began a few months ago. The lady's behavior grew erratic. There were sudden, violent outbursts of temper directed at the elder son, Jack, for no discernible reason. Then came a disturbing lassitude, periods where she would seem distant, almost in a trance. But the true horror, Watson, began with the baby. He turned back to face me, his expression grim. The nurse, a trusted and long-serving member of the household, was the first to raise the alarm. On 2 separate occasions, she found the infant crying in his cot with a small, bleeding wound on his neck. The wound was tiny, like 2 pinpricks. The mother, who had been alone with the child, offered no explanation, merely reacting with a strange, fierce anger. Ferguson, desperate to believe in his wife, dismissed the nurse's fears as hysteria. He could not bring himself to suspect the woman he adored. My medical instincts were on high alert. A wound on the neck? It could be anything, Holmes. An insect bite. A scratch from a pin on his clothing. So, Ferguson reasoned. Holmes cut in. until he saw it with his own eyes. A few nights ago, he was awakened by a cry from the nursery. He rushed in. The nurse was absent. The room was lit by a dim nightlight. And there, Watson, there was his wife, leaning over the cradle. He heard a distinct sucking sound. He saw her lips pressed against the baby's throat. When she looked up, her mouth was smeared with the blood of her own child. The image was so vile, so monstrous, that I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Good God, Holmes, the woman must be utterly insane. A convenient diagnosis, but perhaps too simple, he mused. When he confronted her, she did not deny it. She gave him a look of what he describes as absolute inhuman hatred and fled to her locked room, where she has remained ever since, refusing all food and communication. Ferguson is a broken man. He loves his wife, he adores his child, and he is trapped in a nightmare from which he cannot wake. He is terrified for the baby's life, but also terrified of the scandal that would destroy his family's name if he were to call in the police or the doctors. And so, in his desperation, he turns to me. He ends his letter with a single desperate plea. I am at my wit's end, Mr. Holmes. Is it madness, or is it something older and darker? So we are to go to Sussex? I asked, already feeling the familiar thrill of the chase overriding my initial revulsion. We are, Watson. We shall catch the morning train. Pack your bag and your revolver. When dealing with a creature that drinks the blood of the living, it is always best to be prepared. His tone was light, but there was a steely glint in his eye that told me he was taking this far more seriously than he let on. The journey to Sussex was a blur of green fields and rolling hills, a stark contrast to the grim nature of our errand. As we rattled along in our train carriage, Holmes was uncharacteristically silent, his chin sunk upon his chest, his mind clearly sifting through the bizarre facts of the case. I watched him, wondering what possible logical framework could contain such a Gothic horror. Was it a case of mental derangement, a specific and terrible form of psychosis? Or was Holmes, for once, entertaining the notion of the supernatural? We were met at the station by a horse and trap, and the drive to Cheeseman's took us through winding country lanes bordered by ancient oaks. The house itself was a sprawling, beautiful old manor of gray stone, covered in ivy and steeped in history. But as we drew closer, I felt a distinct chill in the air that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. The house seemed to be holding its breath, weighed down by a silent, oppressive sorrow. Our client, Robert Ferguson, was waiting for us on the steps. He was a giant of a man, with broad shoulders and the weathered face of an adventurer, but his frame was stooped, and his eyes were filled with a haunted, desperate grief. The hand that gripped mine was cold and trembled slightly. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Thank God you have come. I do not know how much more of this I can bear." "Courage, Mr. Ferguson," Holmes said, his voice unusually gentle. "There is no problem that human reason cannot solve. Let us go inside, and you shall tell me everything, leaving out no detail, however trivial it may seem." We were shown into a grand, oak-paneled library. A fire crackled in the hearth, but it did little to dispel the gloom. Ferguson sank into a large leather armchair and buried his face in his hands for a moment, a shudder racking his powerful body. "She is still in her room, Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice muffled. "She will not speak. She will not eat. My beautiful, vibrant wife. It is as if a demon has taken possession of her. Before this nightmare began, she was the gentlest soul imaginable, devoted, loving. How could she turn into that?" "Tell me about her background, Mr. Ferguson," Holmes prompted softly. "You mentioned she is from Peru." "Yes. I met her on a business trip to Lima. She was the daughter of a wealthy merchant. Her beauty was legendary, but it was her spirit, her passion, that captivated me. There was never any question of any darkness in her family. They were devout Catholics, The idea that she could be this thing is unthinkable. And her behavior towards your elder son, Jack? Ferguson's brow furrowed. That was the first sign. It was inexplicable. Jack adores her. Truly, he does. He has always been a sensitive, loving boy, especially since his accident. But she would fly into these rages at him. Once, she struck him. I was appalled. She was immediately remorseful, weeping and begging for his forgiveness. But the incidents continued, growing more frequent. It was as if she were two different people. And the baby? I asked, unable to keep silent. The wounds on his neck. Have you examined them yourself? I have, he whispered, his face ashen. They are exactly as the nurse described. 2 small, red puncture marks. They fade after a day or two, but they are unmistakable. After I found her that night, I barred her from the nursery. The child is under the constant watch of the nurse and myself. But I live in constant terror, Mr. Holmes. I see her face in my dreams, that look of hatred, and the blood on her lips. Holmes listened patiently, his fingertips pressed together, his eyes closed. When Ferguson had finished, there was a long silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire. I must see the child, Holmes said at last. And I should also like to speak with the nurse, and with your son, Jack. We were led upstairs to the nursery, a bright, airy room that felt like the only cheerful place in the entire house. The baby, a plump and healthy-looking infant, was sleeping peacefully in his cot. The nurse, a stern-looking woman with a pinched face, stood guard beside him. She eyed Holmes with suspicion. Holmes bent over the cot, examining the child's neck with a magnifying glass. He said nothing, but his brow was furrowed in concentration. He then turned his attention to the room itself, his gaze sweeping over every detail. Next, we found the boy, Jack, in the garden. He was moving slowly with the aid of crutches, his frail body a stark contrast to his father's robust physique. He had a bright, intelligent face, but his eyes held a shadow of sadness. He spoke of his stepmother with a curious mixture of affection and fear. She used to be so kind to me, he said, his voice soft. She would read to me for hours, but then she changed. She started to hate me. I don't know why. I never did anything to her. As he spoke, he idly threw a small stone at the family's old spaniel, which was dozing in a patch of sunlight. The dog yelped and limped away, and I saw Holmes's eyes narrow for a fraction of a second. It was a fleeting, almost imperceptible moment of cruelty. We returned to the library. Holmes paced back and forth, his energy now electric. "Ferguson," he said suddenly, "the collection of curiosities your wife brought with her from Peru. Where are they?" Ferguson looked surprised. "In the drawing room. Mostly pottery, some old textiles, a few weapons, nothing of any particular note." "Show them to me." The drawing room was filled with the exotic artifacts. Holmes ignored the pottery and tapestries, his eyes scanning the walls. He stopped before a display of antique weaponry, blowpipes, bows, and a case of small, wicked-looking arrows. He picked one up, examining its tip with intense focus. "Aha!" he exclaimed, a triumphant note in his voice. He turned to me, his face alight with discovery. "Watson, do you recall my monograph upon the subject of curare, the South American arrow poison? It is known to cause paralysis and, in sufficient doses, death. But in minute quantities, it merely causes localized inflammation and lethargy." He turned back to the astonished Ferguson. "There is no vampire in this house, Mr. Ferguson. But there is a poisoner, and there is a mother whose desperate love for her child has driven her to actions that mimic the most monstrous of legends." At that moment, the door to the drawing room opened, and a woman stood there. She was tall and slender, with a cascade of black hair and enormous, dark eyes that burned with a feverish intensity. Her face was pale and drawn, but it was a face of such staggering beauty that it was easy to understand Ferguson's devotion. This was the Peruvian wife. "I heard your voice," she said, her accent a low, musical whisper. "You are the detective. You have come to take me away." "On the contrary, madam," Holmes said, his voice now soft and commanding. "I have come to reveal the truth of why you have been secretly sucking the poison from your own child's neck." The woman gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Ferguson let out a strangled cry and took a step towards her, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning comprehension. Holmes held up the small dart. "The poison was not administered by you, madam. It was delivered by this, fired from a blowpipe by someone who wished the child harm. Someone resentful of the new baby's place in his father's affections. Someone who knew of these poisons and how to use them. Your son, Mr. Ferguson, Jack." The pieces fell into place with a sickening crash. The boy's cruelty to the dog, his feigned affection mixed with fear, his jealousy, twisted by his own disability and his father's new family, had curdled into a murderous rage. The mother, her eyes flooding with tears, finally broke her silence. "I saw him," she wept, her voice breaking. "I saw him from my window, practicing with the blowpipe in the garden. Then I found the first mark on my baby. I knew what it was. I could not tell my husband. To accuse his own son, it would have destroyed him. So, when I found the new wounds, I did the only thing a mother could do. I sucked the poison out. I would rather he think me a monster, a vampire, than know his son was a murderer." She collapsed into her husband's arms, her body shaking with sobs of relief and long-suppressed anguish. Ferguson held her, his own tears streaming down his face as he looked from his wife to Holmes, his expression one of awe and profound gratitude. Holmes watched them for a moment, then turned discreetly to me. "Our work here is done, Watson," he murmured. "The cure for the boy's twisted soul will require more than my humble services, but we have, at least, banished the vampire from Sussex." As we traveled back to London that evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across the peaceful countryside, Holmes was quiet for a long time. Finally, he looked over at me, a philosophical light in his eyes. "The world is full of obvious things which nobody by any chance ever observes, Watson," he remarked. "And sometimes the most grotesque and unbelievable explanation is merely a mask for a simple, tragic human truth. A mother's love, in this case, a force more powerful and more primal than any creature of the night."